Dear viewers, this is our weekly show called The Expert Speaks, where an expert on topic will come and talk about the common subjects which are of relevance to you. Today's topic that we have picked up for conversation today is what are the obligations for NRIs with respect to payment of goods and service taxes, otherwise known as GST. This is NRI Money Clinic for you, and I am Dr. Chandrakant Bhatt, your financial guide for a happy living.
NRI Money Clinic. No hype, just the right advice.
Dear viewers, we here at NRI Money Clinic are trying to solve many of the problems faced by the NRI community. We are in a position to solve the problems faced by this community here in India. But our NRI community has lots of questions, lots of problems in the countries where they are living. If you are a professional who is working in US, Canada, UK, Ireland, Eurozone, Singapore, Australia, Japan, Hong Kong, China or any other countries where you have an NRI community, you have a chance to appear on our channel. If you are one of the professionals, chartered public accountant, a tax specialist, financial planner or advisors in any other financial field, then probably we have an interest in you and you get a chance to appear on our channel. If you are interested to appear on our channel to discuss the problems faced by the NRI community in your respective countries, please send us a WhatsApp message on the number shown here on the screen. We will get in touch with you and we explore the possibilities of associating with you.
Dear viewers, to talk about the GST related issues, I have brought to the studios my eminent faculty, practicing chartered accountant, specialist on GST affairs, Miss Lakshmi. Miss Lakshmi has been a very popular faculty on our channel. She has done several videos in the past, and today she is going to talk about the specific subject of what is the relevance of GST with respect to NRIs, where you should sit and find out are you liable to pay any GST in India even though you are an NRI. Welcome to this show, Miss Lakshmi.
Thank you, sir.
Great. Lakshmi, we have discussed in detail in our episodes earlier that we have done everything that we need to know. What is GST, how to understand it, who has to get a registration, who is exempted. You have done a fantastic job in our videos earlier. I want you to dwell today in this video things that are pertinent to the non-resident Indians, NRIs, and whether it is applicable to them and all the finer points. I have listed a lot of questions for you today. I expect you to kindly help me with the answers. First question to you: whether NRIs are liable to GST or not?
GST law does not recognize a person as a resident or a non-resident based on his stay in India. There is only the concept of supply under GST. Any person who is involved in a supply can be liable for a GST registration depending upon the conditions or the transactions he is involved and the conditions of obtaining a GST registration. Therefore, any person, whether a resident or a non-resident, even if a non-resident is undertaking an outward supply of goods or service during his short span of stay in India, he can still be liable for a GST registration and liable to collect and pay taxes. So, the GST is not revolved around whether a person is resident or non-resident. It is revolved around the concept of a person who is involved in supply or not.
So, Lakshmi, you have disproved the notion that NRIs and GST are two different persons. So, we are from different worlds. So, we are not liable to GST. So, we NRIs are like normal anybody else.
Yes.
So, the law of the land does not discriminate whether you are a resident or an NRI.
Yes, yes.
So, you are all equal.
Yes.
So, just because you live outside of India, don't think that you have come from different world and GST can't touch you. So,
Yes.
that's not possible.
Yes,
Okay.
that's right.
Can you, with the help of few examples, tell me which are the activities where an NRI is required to pay GST?
Yes. A person who is of Indian origin and who is settled abroad can still be owning properties in India which he has let out on rent. This is a supply under GST. A person who is owning a piece of land may construct a building maybe on his own, or maybe he is entering into a development agreement with a developer for constructing a building consisting of shops or apartments meant for sale to independent buyers. If such advances for the apartments or shops are received when the building is under construction, it is a supply under GST. A person may be rendering consultancy services as an independent consultant or an independent contractor. He would be rendering services to entities in India, maybe during his short span of stay in India, or maybe locating in India. Especially during COVID, we have seen many instances where people who were residing abroad have come down to India and maybe got stranded in India, but they continue to render the same service to the entities outside India sitting in India. So, if he is rendering such services as an employee of that organization outside India, it is outside GST, there is no question of GST liability. But where he is rendering such services as an independent consultant or an independent contractor to an entity outside India or maybe to entities within India, it is a supply under GST. Then I have seen very few instances of this transaction. A person who is residing abroad may be running a sole proprietorship firm in India with the help of his family, friends or relatives. This can also make him liable for GST registration because this is also a supply under GST.
If I understood you correctly, one, it could be a business transaction. The second thing could be a routine income generating activity like collection of rents.
Yes.
Or investments in the real estate under construction properties.
Yes.
In such cases, the GST gets applied.
Yes.
Apart from that, the routine commercial activities of consultancy, profession, business, supplies of goods and services to somebody in India. So, that would call for a GST registration and the applicable GST has to be paid.
Yes.
So, irrespective of whether he is an NRI or he is a resident,
In India.
so the law will not look at the status there. So, that liability exists even for an NRI,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Okay. You made a very important point with respect to collection of rents. Owning property is the favorite investment activity of every NRI. There are countless of them, there are lakhs of them, there are multi-lakhs of them, there are millions of people who have this particular issue. My question to you is, just because you own a property and you have rented it out, you are liable to pay GST or there are any threshold limits? See, in our earlier videos you have told about while doing a GST registration, you have mentioned about a specific limits, only turnovers up to such and such a level where you are required to do a GST registration. Now, with respect to these properties owned by NRIs or anybody else, when will the GST registration becomes essential? What are the conditions attached with it?
Yes. Renting of properties, that is letting out of properties for rent, is a supply under GST. As I had previously mentioned in earlier videos, once a transaction is identified as a supply, we should then check if it enjoys any specific exemption under the GST law. So, renting of a residential dwelling for the purpose of residence to a person who is not registered under GST is an exempt supply. I will repeat, renting of residential dwelling for use as residence to a person who is not registered under GST is an exempt supply. Now, if such residential dwelling is rented out to a person who is registered under GST, that is, it is rented out to a business entity, it is a taxable supply. Now, renting of commercial property is again a taxable supply under GST. So, put together all taxable supplies and exempt supplies, if it crosses the aggregate turnover of the threshold limit of maybe 20 lakhs or 10 lakhs, that can make the person liable for GST registration and pay taxes.
Which means the threshold limits what we discussed in our earlier videos will get applied here also. But we have to see to whom you have rented out this particular property.
Yes.
If you have rented out to a person who is not registered under GST, it is treated as an exempt supply.
Residential dwelling is rented out. If a commercial property is rented out to a person, even though he is not registered under GST,
okay,
the supplier of the service, that is the person who is owning the property, will be liable to collect and pay taxes.
Okay. So, if you have rented out this property to another person for the purpose of residence and the person who is staying in that is not a registered person for GST, then this comes under the exemption.
Exempt,
right.
yes.
But if you have rented it out to another business entity or if this is a commercial usage, then this will come under the supply
Yes.
terminology, and the aggregate limits will apply, which is 20 lakhs for most part of India and 10 lakhs in the specified states.
Yes.
But while computing your total limits, you have to take into account both the things.
Yes.
Your receipts by way of rents given to the residential purposes and the rents from other thing, and then you have to arrive at your threshold limits.
Yes, correct.
So if you have crossed the threshold limits, then you are liable to do a GST registration for yourself. But while paying taxes, you pay GST only for those things where you are liable to pay. On the exempt activities, then you need not pay GST on that. Correct?
Correct.
Right.
Sir.
Yeah.
Correct.
Lakshmi, you told about the intricacies of renting out the buildings and when somebody has to pay a GST even if he is an NRI. Another normal activity which we come across is that people invest in properties. It's not that they buy a ready to occupy properties, but they get into a contract with the developers, and some GST implications will follow. Can you throw light on how the GST becomes applicable in such case? What is the responsibility or what is the factors that the NRIs have to consider or keep in mind when they get into such agreements with the developers?
A person who is owning a piece of land enters into an agreement with a developer for the purpose of construction of a building in that property, which may consist of apartments or shops. This is called as a development agreement. Now, if in return for the land, the builder promises to provide constructed apartments or shops to the landowner. That could be one option under the said agreement, or in return for the land, the builder might be giving the landowner a share of revenue that the builder gets from the sale of such apartments or shops. Now, for example, if the landowner is receiving constructed apartments or shop as a return from the builder, which he intends to sell to independent buyers, and he starts receiving advances on such apartments or shops when the building is under construction, then it is a taxable supply under GST. The landowner will have to take a GST registration, collect and pay taxes to the government. Whereas, if the landowner is receiving money, receiving advance, or is selling the constructed apartments or shops only after the receipt of completion certificate of that building, then it becomes an immovable property, and sale of immovable property is outside the purview of GST.
So it is pretty simple here. Now, whatever that you mentioned in your earlier video, that if it is an under construction property, it is liable to pay the GST. The same thing here, instead of developer, it is here the person who is giving land to the developer. The same rule will apply.
Yes, even for the developer on the other side, he is again liable for a payment of GST if the apartments or shops are sold at the time of construction.
Correct. So
both applies.
Correct. So even for the landowner who has got into a development agreement with the builder, the same system will follow.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So even if he is an NRI, the same system has to be followed.
Yes.
Okay. One another case in point which comes to my mind is there are people in India who give services to an NRI outside or to a business outside or anybody outside of India. How does the GST law work in that case? What happens to the GST registrations and what is the obligations under GST?
A person who is rendering independent consultancy or independent contractor services to an entity outside India, the person who is providing the service should be located in India, and he is providing such services to an entity or an individual outside India, for which he receives convertible foreign currency to the bank account in India. This is called as export of service under GST. And export of service is a taxable supply under GST that can make that person liable for GST registration if the aggregate turnover exceeds the threshold limit.
So if I understood you correctly, so the export services, there is no special exemptions with respect to GST registration. Okay. If it is described as a supply, then if the turnover exceeds the threshold limit, GST registration has to be obtained.
Yes.
What rate you have to pay taxes, whether it has an exemptions, not exemptions, that's a different topic altogether.
Yes.
But in arriving at your threshold limits and arriving at your eligibility or requirement to do a registration, so services provided to an entity outside of India must also be taken into account.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Correct. Okay. Lakshmi, you mentioned that the export of services have to be taken into account for arriving at GST registration. But I get to read a lot of reports telling that there are exemptions, there are benefits, there are subsidies and all kind of a thing, benefits that are given by the government for export of services. Now, because he has registered under the GST, he is liable to pay the GST, or a different regime will follow beyond that point.
Export of goods or service is a taxable supply under GST. But since it is intended in bringing in foreign currency to the country, the government has given certain benefits or relaxations to the exporter in order to boost exports in the country. Now, what are the benefits that the exporter gets? The exporter of goods or service will be refunded all the tax he suffers in doing such export transaction. And export of goods or service can be done under two options under GST. The first option is it can be done under a letter of undertaking, LUT, letter of undertaking, wherein at the time of doing the export, the exporter will not have to pay any taxes on the export transaction, and at the same time he would have incurred input taxes on the various inward supply that he would have availed for the purpose of providing this export transaction, may it be goods or service. So, the input tax he has suffered in this case will be refunded to the exporter. That is the first option. Second option is he can do the export with payment of taxes. When I mean to say with payment of taxes, it does not mean that he can collect the tax amount from the foreign entity. Taxes cannot be exported. It is only the goods or services that can be exported. So, in this case, the taxes will have to be borne by the exporter himself. Now, how would he bear the tax cost? Here again he would have incurred input taxes on the inward goods or services that he has purchased or availed. That can be utilized for the payment of the output tax. For example, he is exporting a service worth 10 lakhs on which he is liable to pay a GST of 1,80,000, and he has already incurred an input cost of rupees 1 lakh. Now, he can net off the 1 lakh input tax he has already incurred and pay only the balance of 80,000 to the government. Now, here what is the amount of tax he has suffered ultimately? It is rupees 1,80,000 that he has suffered. This entire 1,80,000 will be refunded to him. Now, how does this refund happens? Refund has to take place through a separate application to the government with the support of certain documents evidencing that he is involved in the export transaction, and the refunds under exports are granted on a timely basis if the documents are correct.
Lakshmi, I'll ask you a very practical question now. Somebody is liable to do the GST registration. He has done a GST registration. What are the compliance requirements he has to fulfill once he does the GST registration?
A person who takes a GST registration shall be required to comply with all the rules and regulations mandated under the GST law. He will have to maintain proper books of accounts. He will have to raise the invoice in the format prescribed under the GST law, and he will have to file regular tax returns to pay the taxes to the government. And it does not matter whether in a particular month he is doing a supply or not. Once he gets himself registered, he is required to file the tax returns on a monthly basis without fail, irrespective of whether there is a supply in a particular month or not.
You mean to say if there is no transactions in that month, but he has to file the returns?
Yes, he can file a nil return.
It can be a nil return.
Yes.
But you have an obligation to file the return. So, you can't say that I will do a filing after 3 months, 6 months because I don't have a turnover, I will not file the returns. No. There has to be a reporting.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Or maybe you have to cancel the registration either way.
Yes, correct.
Only two.
Yes.
So, you have a registration, you file the returns every month. Otherwise, you feel that you have nothing to do beyond this point, you apply for a cancellation of the registration.
Correct.
That's the only option.
Yes.
There are some people who don't take care of all these things. They just neglect and they think, let's see when it comes to it. What consequences will follow if you are not registered under GST, in case you are supposed to be registered under GST but you are not done a GST registration? What consequences will follow?
Here, let me give you one very important information. Data or information is easily shared from the income tax department to the GST department. So, you are all or we are all filers of income tax returns, and we would have declared our income, maybe we would have declared it as professional receipts or maybe business receipts, etc. So, GST department can easily come to know what the income you have declared in any particular financial year. And there is always a possibility that you can get a notice from the GST authorities asking you why you have not taken a GST registration and paid the taxes even when you were liable for a registration and payment of taxes. And consequences of non-registration would be the amount of tax evaded plus 100% penalty of the tax amount along with interest for the days of delay.
That's a lot of information. Dear viewers, if you have lots of properties in India and you are generating a lot of rent, please consult your chartered accountant and check from them whether you are liable to pay GST on the rentals that you receive or under any other head. If you are supposed to do a GST registration, it's time that you go through a GST registration and pay the applicable taxes. Do not neglect this view. Today we live in an era where everything is digitized and every information is available to the government. It's not worth taking the risk, and if you get caught, which most likely you will be, then the consequences will be really horrible. So please rework out your rental receipts and all other affairs which are there in India. If you are supposed to pay taxes on the GST, this is the time. Take the next step of registering for the GST. Lakshmi, thank you very much for taking your time, coming to the studios, briefing our audience what are the things that they need to know, and disproving that the NRIs are not liable to pay any GST. So NRIs, as I said, like every other resident Indian, if you are liable to pay GST, you need to go through this registration process. Thank you very much for your time. On behalf of NRI Money Clinic and on behalf of my audience, a big thank you to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Dear viewers, hope the episode that I have done helped you to understand whether NRIs come under the GST purview or not. If it helped you to understand the finer points of GST applicable for the NRIs, please like this video. If you are a person who is watching my channel for the first time, or if you are yet to subscribe for the channel, please hit the subscribe button and press the bell icon. Don't forget to share this video with all your NRI friends. Thank you very much for watching this episode on NRI Money Clinic. I shall be back with you with yet another topic, yet another video in my next session very soon.
Press the bell icon for more details and subscribe our channel.